Coming to DARPA is like grabbing the nose cone of a rocket and holding on for dear life.
DARPA is a place where if you don't invent the internet, you only get a B.
A DARPA program manager quite literally invents tomorrow.
Coming to work every day and being humbled by that.
DARPA is not one person or one place. It's a collection of people that are excited about moving technology forward.
Hello, and welcome to Voices from DARPA. I'm your host, Tom Shortridge. That quote in the intro about how if you don't invent the internet, you only get a B, that's a huge part of the culture here at DARPA. Program managers are always thinking about creating programs that could have that kind of lasting societal impact. But you have to remember, when DARPA, or ARPA at the time, created the ARPANET, it wasn't a turnkey gadget or product. It was actually a few computers connected over phone lines passing data back and forth. From that foundation, it took years and further investment from both the government and commercial industry and the adoption by millions and billions of people to become the ingrained part of our daily lives that we know today as the internet. That's the kind of fundamental research we're exploring today with the In the Moment program. Here's Program Manager Dr. Patrick Shafto.
The In the Moment program addresses, in the broadest sense, a key question about how we should think about humans and AIs working together in the future. And it's motivated by a particular kind of scenario, large trauma events. And what happens in that kind of situation is it can rapidly overwhelm a hospital. People were overwhelmed. And the question that brings up is, under what conditions would a human delegate life or death decisions to an AI system? And in particular, it addresses this question about alignment, which is above and beyond being correct or not. Does it matter to humans that the AI system reflects our decision-making preferences, our morals and ethics, and so on? And would that increase the chances of us delegating in a situation? So the structure of the program, we have teams whose job it is to characterize people's decision-making. The other side, the machine learning or AI side, how do we make systems that can be aligned to different human decision makers? There are two other parts of the program that I think are also deeply interesting and relevant. One of them is related to evaluation. So how do we evaluate these kinds of scenarios? There's the question of alignment, but there's also the question of the details of the situation itself. We've been developing virtual reality technologies to kind of simulate the challenges of making decisions in these high-stakes life or death scenarios. And then the other one is an embedded ELSI component, so the ethical, legal, social implications. So thinking through when could we or should we delegate, but also what are the policy implications? We're going to need rules for when this can or should be applied. Getting policymakers to start to think about these questions. Obviously, we don't expect within the life of the program to produce policies. That's not even within DARPA's mission per se. But it is important to make sure that policies exist so that, when the technology arrives, people are ready.
The ITM program is approaching these challenges from multiple angles. First, how can we define and measure the key characteristics that influence an individual's decision-making process? Dr. Alice Lung of the RTX BBN team will explain how they're tackling this complex problem.
Our part is in decision-maker characterization. That means understanding why different experts do different things and how to succinctly assess and measure these differences in people and how to summarize these kinds of differences in a way that an AI can take that information in and use it to make future decisions. The first challenge is even to understand what characteristics of an expert matter. And we call those kinds of individual characteristics, we call them attributes. And we're trying to boil down in this domain, in the domain of medical triage, what are the important attributes that vary from person to person and that have a high impact on trust.
Identifying and measuring these individual decision-making attributes is no easy feat. Dr. Joseph Cohn from Sortec, another team working on decision-maker characterization, describes the process they've developed.
So the first thing that we have to do is just identify what these decision-making attributes might be in the first place. Then we have to figure out what it means to measure these attributes. And then ultimately, If we identify that these attributes reflect consistently different archetypes of how people make decisions, and if the hypothesis we're trying to prove is that we will delegate more frequently to AI systems that think like us, how do we quantify an alignment between a human decision maker and an autonomous decision-making tool? Once we come up with that list, what we have to do is identify a context within which to elicit those decision-making attributes, or what we call scenarios. There would be activities in the scenario and there would be probes. And based on how an individual responds to those probes throughout the scenario, we can create a score of how they are responding to those different probes and ultimately link that back to that one attribute.
So asking people about situations where there is a conflict between two values or two priorities is how we get at measuring attributes. This particular program is using triage as a demonstration domain, but we definitely have in mind that the methodology and the approach should work in any kind of decision-making situation.
Once we understand the factors that shape human decisions, the next step is to translate those into algorithms. Here's Dr. Matthew Molyneux of Parallax Advanced Research.
So the characterization of people is being done by another team. And we take those characterizations and we use them to try to find the best possible decisions automatically, rapidly, and without direct human intervention at the time when the decision is made.
Kitware's Dr. Urslin Basharat, who previously appeared in Voices from DARPA on episode 69, where he discussed his work on the semantic forensics program, outlines his team's perspective.
We are looking at various different types of approaches where our goal is to do the decision-making based on the parameters that we're asked to make decisions under, so specific attributes and specific values of such attributes. So those are the challenges that these difficult mission-critical environments that humans have to deal with, and then we are doing the challenging task of developing these decision-making algorithms that have to then emulate such humans to make such trade-offs while not compromising some of the key goals of the mission. So our team is specifically looking at some of the great advances that have been made in the field of AI, in the field of large language models. And we are benefiting from that in the sense that we are trying to utilize a lot of knowledge that has been accumulated and incorporated in such language models. And then we are trying to improve such models with adding additional goals, the primary goals of alignment, and then also adding explainability in natural language. We made a decision of alignment in this specific scenario, and why did we make this choice given these kind of requirements that were provided to us.
Though the Kitware and Parallax teams are working towards the same goal of algorithmic decision makers, they are taking separate paths. That's a common theme for many DARPA programs. Diversity of thought can be immensely beneficial for research, especially of the type DARPA undertakes, which has no clear correct answers. Dr. Molyneux explains the Parallax team's approach.
We are trying to make AIs that can be trusted because they are aligned to people we trust. It's based on a case-based reasoning approach. Case-based reasoning is defined around the concept of memory. So we remember past situations in which particular decisions were made, and we judge the similarity to those past decisions. We find past situations that were similar, and we try to make a decision that was similar to a trusted decision maker in an appropriate past situation. I call it an alignable decision maker because given an input, a set of attributes for a person, it can use those to generate answers like that person. I don't want to retrain it for every person. I want to be able to quickly ask a new person a bunch of questions and then start making decisions like them. Our algorithm is focused on being alignable, on training in advance to be able to quickly become like a new decision maker.
Now, once human decision makers have been characterized and a list of attributes has been generated, and algorithmic decision makers have been developed, what's next? Here's Dr. Jennifer McVeigh of CACI to shed light on the third element of ITM, evaluation.
My team specifically is called the evaluation team, but I would say big picture, our role is more of an integration role on this program. So we are taking the materials and the AIs developed by other performing teams and combining them into an experiment to look at this effect of alignment on delegation and trust. We take the AIs, we take the scenarios and probes, and we are administering those assessments to our human delegators so we know where they fall on that particular attribute. We have also generated the testbed to administer those scenarios to the AIs and get their responses. And then we're also presenting back the responses from the AIs to those human delegators to understand their trust ratings and their delegation preferences to those AIs. And so we have to make sure in setting that up that we are showing the humans a variety of AIs that are either aligned or misaligned in addition to the baseline so that we can understand their preference relative to their own attribute score.
Those evaluations and testbeds have evolved throughout the program, as Dr. Cohn from SORTEC describes here.
So this is where it gets really cool. So initially, this was more of a text-based conversation. You're here, and really the participants are reading through a script, for instance. We're tracking what choices they make. The next step in that, and we're doing this right now with our other partners on the program, is to embed those scenarios in an interactive virtual reality simulation. So now you've got this more immersive, more presence-engendering sense of I'm in the moment, and I've got to make these decisions.
Dr. Matthew Molyneux from Parallax.
We are looking at life and death decisions with AIs. We should face that directly. There's a lot of fear out there about how AIs will handle this kind of a situation, and that's reasonable. But that we'd like people to keep an open mind because there are people out there who are making these life and death decisions without help. I think that it can go a long way to helping out, to making the world a better place, well beyond triage.
Which brings us to the final component of ITM, ELSI, ethical, legal, and societal implications. Again, multiple teams with separate focus areas are approaching this. Let's start with Dr. David Cotting and Sarah Daly of the Institute for Defense Analyses, IDA.
As performers develop and think about the work that they have to do within ITM, they do that in accordance with some consideration about ELSI, that is ethical, legal, and social implications. So in other words, our role is not as defined as specific product, but rather trying to support those performers in producing results in a manner that's consistent with those considerations.
We're sort of injecting ELSI into the technical performer teams to help them understand the sort of ELSI-dense concepts of the problem area. And so we're taking advantage of that setup to make sure that we're using ITM to actually advance ELSI methodologies. So in some ways, the project itself outside of the performer teams is almost like a sandbox for how can we as an ELSI consultation team advance how we do that? How can we think about tools that will help future program managers? How can we think about the higher level consequences of doing this type of work and how that might bubble up to something like a policy requirement?
While the IDA team is focused more on ELSI internally with the other performer teams, the University of Maryland Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security team, or ARLIS, is looking externally. Here are Lauren Diaz and Ellie Tyler.
In terms of policy, you first have to have acceptance. You have to have influencers and advocates who want an algorithmic decision maker to perform triage in this case. We engage with all manner of subject matter experts whom we believe could have an impact on the program in some way. Because we're talking about battlefield triage, it makes a whole lot of sense to engage with the military medical community. And we've absolutely done that every step of the way. We also talk to lawyers, the legal community, regulatory communities. We have conversations with ethicists. We also talk to philosophers.
That's why it's so important to talk to a wide range of experts, because you need people that have the legal perspective, you know, the military, the medical, the policy perspective, to all kind of engage in that discussion and poke holes in their own ways so that you can think about all of the potential risks that could trickle down the line.
So we gather perspective from subject matter experts. We provide an interface between them and performers in the shape of conferences or workshops. You need those advocates and influencers to say, yeah, we need this. We need to improve survivability. We need a system like this.
And performer teams on the ITM program certainly seem to be advocates for a healthy emphasis on ELSI. Here's Dr. Alice Loam of RTX BBN.
I think that DARPA programs have always had an interest in social implications, and scientists have always tried to be as ethical as they can. So I would say that the themes that we're considering are very similar, but that because this program is about decision-making and decision-making specifically in very difficult situations, there is a lot more explicit interest in moral and ethical values than there might be in a program that is more about hardware performance or that has metrics that don't really involve humans as much.
Dr. Jennifer McVeigh, CACI.
For myself and many of our academic contributors, that's really important to know that we are thinking about those things and not just kind of plowing ahead and developing AI, especially sometimes for military applications, without having that in-house ethical and legal and societal implications emphasis on the work. And I know that many of the performers have found it really useful to have the questions being asked and the discussions being had very early in development so that later down the road, as these things are being built out and potential use cases develop, we're not having to walk back some of the things that we've moved forward on, but it's right there from the beginning.
Dr. Joseph Cohn, SORTEC.
In my career in uniform, I've spent most of my time working in human performance enhancing capabilities or biomedical capabilities. ELSI comes in a lot at the end of any development effort. Like, oh, hey, if we are able to create this decision-making tool, what are the ELSI implications? That's a great conversation. But really, I think the most important time to have that conversation is at the beginning when you're envisioning what that capability would look like.
Lauren Diaz, Arliss.
So this is what we're trying to discover with members of the policy community is, you know, what is this thing? Is it a medical device? Trying to understand what actually applies, really looking at it and thinking about ITM or maybe algorithmic decision makers in the continuum of care and, thinking where are the gray areas here? What actually doesn't apply? Where are there some ambiguities here? And then bringing in those policy experts that know that policy and saying what would actually work? What would apply to ITM? What could apply actually more broadly as well and be helpful for other programs?
Dr. David Cotting, IDA.
This is where I think that the progress you make in this space could actually sort of translate into better understanding that's beyond the technology and AI. It offers us a way of thinking about what is good, what is it that we're trying to get more of, what is bad, what is it that we're trying to not do. And I think that the exercise of self-understanding and self-reflection, now with those new technology and AI in particular, the questions that are rising and elements of thinking that come out of programs like ITM, they're way beyond the technology, and I would argue much beyond DARPA.
And speaking of DARPA, here's Program Manager Dr. Patrick Shafto again.
ITM is a really interesting program in that it's a good bit more forward-leaning than many DARPA programs. In some sense, we're anticipating technology that will come soon, as opposed to trying to develop that technology right away, right? At the end of the program, we don't expect to deploy this in life or death scenarios necessarily, right? If we could, that would be great, but that's not our conditions for winning here. Our conditions for winning are validating this hypothesis about alignment, and that shift is one that matters a lot, right? The question of alignment and whether it matters for delegation is one that could have much broader implications than any specific technology that we could develop. And the social and legal regimes in which we think about that also could have extremely broad implications, right? In terms of like what kinds of technologies can be developed or should be developed or deployed in different kinds of scenarios. And so if we can come away from the program with a clear statement of what we mean by alignment and why it matters, then I think we will have made a great contribution to society broadly.
That's all for this episode of Voices from DARPA. To learn more about the ITM program, explore the resources available on darpa.mil. Check the show notes for direct links. As always, thanks for listening.